Imagine looking through a periscope into the pitch-black Atlantic night. You are a German U-boat commander, a hunter in the most lethal wolf pack on Earth. Your radio operators intercepted a frantic signal. A massive British supply convoy is just 10 miles due east. You can almost smell the diesel and the victory. You order your crew to battle stations. The torpedoes are loaded. The tension is suffocating. You surface to strike, and you find nothing. There is no convoy. There are no ships. Only the cold, empty ocean and the mocking sound of the wind. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a mistake. You had just been hunting a ghost. Welcome to the Battle of the Atlantic, where the most powerful weapon wasn't a depth charge or a torpedo. It was a lie. In the darkest days of World War II, when Britain was starving and the German Kriegsmarine seemed invincible, the Royal Navy unleashed a secret weapon that didn't blow ships up. It drove their crews insane. This is the untold story of the British Phantom fleets and the deception that broke the back of the wolf packs. To truly grasp the genius and desperation behind the British deception, we must plunge into the icy, churning waters of the Battle of the Atlantic in 1941 and 1942. This was not merely a battle. It was the unseen, existential fight for Great Britain's very survival. The situation for the island nation was nothing short of desperate. Britain, an industrial powerhouse, had long relied on the sea lanes for everything. Food to feed its population, raw materials to fuel its factories, oil to run its military vehicles, and ammunition to fight the war. The Atlantic convoys were the nation's fragile, beating heart. If that heart stopped, Britain would be forced to surrender, regardless of the fighting spirit of its soldiers. And the Germans were masters at trying to stop that heart. Led by Admiral Karl Donitz, the German U-boat arm had perfected a lethal tactic, the wolf pack. These were not isolated submarine patrols. They were coordinated, savage attacks. The German strategy was ruthless but devastatingly efficient. It relied on a vast network of reconnaissance and radio intelligence. When a lone U-boat, often cruising on the surface where it was fastest, happened upon an Allied convoy, it would not attack immediately. The U-boat commander would become a scout, shadowing the vulnerable ships from a distance, constantly transmitting contact reports back to the BDs, the German Naval Radio Intelligence Service in occupied France. Headquarters would then use these reports to vector in every available submarine in the sector. The signal would go out, rendezvous and attack. The U-boats would converge, sometimes 15 or 20 vessels simultaneously, swarming the convoy under the cover of the vast, black Atlantic night. In the moonless darkness, the Allied escorts, often just a handful of destroyers and corvettes, were blind and overwhelmed. The U-boats, small and low in the water, were nearly impossible to spot, popping up like rays to fire their torpedoes into the packed ranks of merchant ships before plunging back beneath the waves. The results were catastrophic. In the period known to the Americans as the Second Happy Time, after the U.S. entered the war, U-boats were sinking Allied merchant ships faster than the Allied shipyards could build them. Month after month, the grim tally of lost tonnage climbed. In March 1943 alone, the U-boat sank 108 ships. Food rationing became stricter. Industrial production faced constant shortages. The morale of the British people, while resilient, was strained by the constant threat of starvation and defeat. Winston Churchill himself later admitted that the U-boat threat was the only thing that truly frightened him during the war. The Allies were losing the tonnage war. They simply did not have enough destroyers, corvettes, or long-range aircraft to provide continuous, adequate protection to every convoy crossing the massive 3,000-mile expanse of the Atlantic. They couldn't outfight the sheer numbers of the coordinated wolf packs. A change in strategy was urgently needed. The British Admiralty, filled with brilliant minds in naval strategy, mathematics, and, crucially, wireless technology, realized profound truth. If they couldn't outgun the Germans, they had to outsmart them. They needed a way to break the wolf pack concentration. They needed to force the U-boats to disperse, to chase phantom contacts, and to waste their finite supplies of fuel, torpedoes, and, most importantly, time. They had to make the unforgiving vastness of the ocean feel even bigger, to sow doubt in the minds of the German commanders and force the U-boats to look in the wrong places. The goal was to feed the enemy intelligence so compelling, so seemingly real that they would invest everything in a lie. The British Admiralty resolved to use the Germans' greatest asset, their sophisticated radio intelligence network, as the very weapon to defeat them. They had to make the Germans see things that weren't there. Faced with impending disaster, the British Admiralty turned to a core of quiet, brilliant minds who would become the unsung heroes of the war. The wireless operators, cryptographers, and intelligence officers. Their battleground wasn't the sea. It was an invisible spectrum of radio waves. They devised a cunning plan of electronic misdirection, a tactic so effective it would later be studied by militaries worldwide. The plan was simple in its concept, but fiendishly complex in its execution. Operation Ghost Signal. The entire scheme relied on exploiting the Germans' greatest perceived strength, their meticulous reliance on radio intercepts. The British knew the German B-Dienst listening stations, located along the occupied coast of France, were picking up virtually every Allied transmission. So, the British decided to stop trying to hide their chatter and instead give the Germans a show, a meticulously rehearsed radio drama played out across the Atlantic airwaves. The Royal Navy began orchestrating elaborate fake convoys, but unlike the famous deception tactics involving dummy tanks, this was not about putting cardboard ships on the water. This was electronic warfare, decades ahead of its time. British intelligence officers, working in high secrecy, would first create an operational script, literally a detailed screenplay for a battle that was not happening. This script defined the precise route, speed, escort strength, and most critically, the radio habits of a massive, vulnerable convoy. They understood that authenticity was paramount. The implementation was genius. A small, fast vessel, perhaps a single destroyer operating hundreds of miles from any real shipping lane, would act as an orchestra conductor. Sometimes, the entire transmission sequence would be generated from a heavily shielded and powerful transmitter located far ashore, possibly in a remote area of Scotland. These isolated sources would begin broadcasting heavy, dense, and carefully timed radio traffic. They weren't just sending random noise. They were mimicking the specific, repetitive chatter of a 40-ship convoy moving under wartime conditions. The operators mimicked the voices and cadence of merchant captains talking to their naval escorts, routine reports about engine trouble, requests for course adjustments, and logistical checks that gave the impression of dozens of ships tightly grouped. They simulated the frantic, tense signals of destroyers detecting a threat, possible contact bearing 090, increased depth charge readiness, and most crucially, the specific, high-priority operational codes used by a naval escort under direct attack. They even varied the signal strength and used directional antennas to make the transmissions appear to be coming from a large, spatially spread-out group of ships, exactly as a real convoy would appear to a distant German listening post. The effect was instantaneous and overwhelming. To the German listening stations in Brest or Lorient, the airwaves were lighting up like a Christmas tree. Their sophisticated receivers were logging hundreds of transmissions, all converging on a single set of coordinates. Their plotters saw a massive, seemingly vulnerable convoy, a prize of unimaginable value, moving slowly through a specific accessible grid in the North Atlantic. The illusion was flawless. The intelligence was undeniable. The goal wasn't just to transmit information, but to generate actionable intelligence that the German High Command could resist. The deception played perfectly into Admiral Donit's strategy of mass attacks. The message received by the Kriegsmarine was crystal clear. We have found a mega target. Deploy the wolf packs now. The trap was set not with mines or guns, but with carefully crafted lies transmitted through the air. The crucial, agonizing next step for the Germans was to commit their valuable U-boats, fuel, and manpower to chasing a ghost. The operational success of the ghost signals was not measured in ships saved, but in the psychological wreckage inflicted on the enemy. For the German U-boat crews, the vaunted wolf packs, the impact of this deception was nothing short of psychological torture. In their concrete command bunkers in France, the German High Command would intercept the frantic, overwhelming chatter of the ghost convoy. The intelligence was seemingly irrefutable. They would immediately order their operational U-boats, sometimes dozens strong, to divert. The command was simple and urgent. Break off current patrol. Race to quadrant X-ray. Massive convoy awaits. The crews obeyed, but the cost was immense. U-boats would burn precious diesel fuel, racing at flank speed across hundreds of miles of violent, rough seas to intercept this juicy target. Every gallon wasted was less time they could spend on patrol, and every hour spent traveling was an hour they weren't sinking actual ships. Picture the grueling scene inside the steel coffin of a Type 9 U-boat during this desperate rush. The air is thick and foul, heavy with the smell of diesel, unwashed bodies, and stale food. The crew is utterly exhausted. They haven't seen the sun in days, sleeping in rotation right next to the massive, sweating engines. Their adrenaline, however, is now surging. This is it. The moment they train for a chance for a massive victory that could turn the tide of the war. They arrive at the designated coordinates, the commander rigid behind the periscope, the torpedo men ready to strike. They scan the horizon. They strain their eyes for the dark silhouettes of tankers and freighters, the vulnerable giants that would mark their triumph. But hour after hour, they find nothing. The dark ocean is empty. The waves break with a mocking sound. There is no mast, no funnel, no wake. The commander, furious and confused, orders a dive. The sub descends silently, and the hydrophone operator presses the headphones tight against his ears, listening for the telltale, rhythmic thump-thump-thump of a score of merchant propellers churning through the water. But all he hears is a groan of their own hull against the deep-sea pressure and the distant whisper of the waves. Silence. The British were masters of patience. They understood that the lie had to be sustained to be effective. The intelligence officers would often keep the ruse going for days on end, broadcasting course changes, simulated engine repairs, and even reports of U-boat attacks on the Ghost Convoy. This forced the German submarines to zigzag, double back, and circle a massive, empty expanse of the ocean. The effect on the U-boat crews was corrosive. Doubt began to fester. Commanders, whose judgment needed to be razor-sharp, started to question the reliability of their own intelligence. Why are we burning fuel for nothing? Did the British spot us? Did the convoys suddenly change course? Or worse, was this entire thing a deception? The confidence and aggressive certainty that had made the wolf pack so deadly began to crumble, replaced by fatigue and paranoia. By the time the German commanders finally realized they had been duped, and this realization could take days, they were low on battery power, critically short on fuel. Their crews were exhausted and demoralized, and they were positioned hundreds of miles away from any real shipping lane. They had been effectively neutralized for days. Meanwhile, the true victory was unfolding elsewhere. While the wolf packs chased ghosts through the empty Atlantic, the actual convoy, laden with vital food, steel, and fuel for the Allied war effort, was slipping through a distant sector of the ocean, moving entirely unmolested, thanks to the vast digital smokescreen created by the unsung heroes of electronic warfare. The British weren't just winning a battle. They were winning a war of nerves, proving that in the ruthless depths of the Atlantic, confusion was a deadlier weapon than any torpedo. This elaborate, high-stakes game of cat and mouse played out across the Atlantic did more than just ensure the safe arrival of vital cargo. It was a strategically critical operation that exhausted the enemy and changed the course of the war. The impact of the ghost signals was a slow, systemic erosion of German operational effectiveness. The logistics of U-boat warfare were already punishing. Every gallon of diesel fuel a U-boat wasted racing across the ocean to intercept a fake signal was a gallon they couldn't use to hunt a real ship. Every hour spent chasing nothing was an hour that a true Allied convoy was steaming safely out of range. Every torpedo they didn't fire in anger was a life saved, a ton of steel delivered, and a weapon retained to a final push against the Axis powers. Crucially, the fake convoys were a brilliant instrument of psychological warfare. They deliberately engineered a profound sense of paranoia and doubt among the German U-boat commanders. These captains, once confident and aggressive hunters, started to hesitate when the radio room received a new contact report, a legitimate, high-priority target. A new question began to poison their judgment. Is this real, or is it merely another one of the Admiralty's elaborate, infuriating tricks? That fleeting moment of hesitation, that single pause of doubt, was often all the Allies needed. It gave the genuine convoy time to adjust course, for escorts to deploy aircraft, or simply to slip away into the massive expanse of the Atlantic. The confidence of the German naval command was shattered, and confidence is a critical, irreplaceable currency in war. The effectiveness of this deception was maximized by its perfect synchronization with the most significant intelligence coup of the war, the breaking of the German Enigma Code. Thanks to the tireless efforts of the code breakers at Bletchley Park, the British often knew exactly where the U-boats were, their current orders, and their intended targets. This intelligence, known as Ultra, became the ultimate counterpunch. The British could deploy their real convoys along a route far away from the known U-boat positions, and then, using the go signals, they would broadcast a fake convoy right into the path of the waiting wolf packs. The Allies were not just hiding. They were actively misleading the enemy directly into an empty quadrant. This lethal combination of knowing the enemy's movements and feeding them elaborate lies effectively turned the hunter into the hunted. The Atlantic Ocean, which had been a shooting gallery for the Germans in the early years of the war, became a confusing, unpredictable maze of mirrors. The constant, fruitless chasing wore down the morale and efficiency of the U-boat arm. Crew fatigue led to mistakes. Fuel consumption soared. U-boat patrol areas became less effective and more dispersed. By the end of the war, the statistics tell the grim truth for the Kriegsmarine. The U-boat arm suffered the highest casualty rate of any branch of the German armed forces. Of the nearly 40,000 men who served in the U-boat service, roughly 30,000, or about 75%, were killed. They were ultimately defeated not just by advanced technology like radar, sonar, and powerful depth charges, but by the relentless, maddening frustration of hunting ghosts that were nothing more than static and carefully scripted lies. The British fake convoys, an operation of dazzling intellectual creativity, proved a timeless truth. In warfare, sometimes the most powerful force on the battlefield is the one you can't see, the one that operates only in the mind of the enemy. It was an invisible victory that secured the lifeline of Britain and paved the way for the ultimate Allied triumph. The Battle of the Atlantic proved that war isn't just about firepower. It's about outthinking the enemy. The British turned the ocean into a weapon, using nothing but radio waves to break the spirit of the wolf packs. If you enjoyed this untold story of World War II, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel. And if you want more deep dives into military history and geopolitical conflicts, make sure to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a story. I want to hear from you. What do you think was the most brilliant deception tactic of World War II? Was it these ghost convoys, or something else like the Ghost Army or Operation Mincemeat? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.